Welcome to SquashWarp episode 7. And here we have Frannis, Kerman, and Sherbin of Gerbin flying back to the Space Center after their brief trip to the deserts nearby. They've done their science and now they're going to come home after a nice gentle touchdown on the runway at the Space Center. And now we jump out to the Slider 1 probe, which we recently launched from the very small cargo bay of our space plane, the Galahad. So these Slider probes are designed to land on moons of Kerbin and get some science experiments. We have every science experiment we've currently unlocked except for Mystery Goo, Materials Bay. I always say one when I mean the other. The Materials Bay is too large to fit inside the cargo bay unless I use tweak scale on it, and then I feel like I'm cheating. So we have all the other science experiments, and we're going to come in over the poles, which will give us more flexibility in picking where we set down, and enable us to set down in one of the pole regions of the moon, which is a biome that you can't get to from a low inclination. Turn down the thrust limiter there so I have sensitivity, because I expect to lose connection. Look at the beautiful Kerbin over the horizon of the moon there. Yes, it looks very much like the Earthrise photo from the Apollo missions. And it turns out we never lost connection. I had set us up to be pointing the right direction and with the thrust limiter so that it would be sensitive if I could only control it with Z and X, but it turns out we didn't need it. Good to be on the safe side regardless. So I think we are going to go for a polar landing, so we're going to accelerate time until we are nearby the poles. The poles can be a tricky place to land because of the way that the shape of the planet distorts the height map. So it can be very pokey and have lots of high mountains and low crags, and landing there can be a bit dangerous, a bit hazardous, which is why we're going to send an unmanned probe there first. I kill our orbital speed so that we start to fall, and I'm not really picking a landing site here. This thing is pretty overpowered. We got a lot of thrust to weight ratio. In fact, I need to turn down the thrust limiter just so that I can have enough control to land gently. All in all, it's a very smooth landing despite the pretty high slope that we find when we arrive. And it's time for science. Let's get all the experiments run. We're going to go ahead and do both Mystery Goo containers and just generally spend all of the science that we possibly can, because we want to justify the flight and that whole design process for that space plane. After all that hard work, the Kerbals deserve to get their science. And instead of transmitting it, I'm actually going to go ahead and get into orbit of the moon again. We overburned a bit. Comes from having an engine that's too powerful when you don't set it on 50% thrust. But after that ant engine that we used on the turtle probe that went out into interplanetary space, I am quite happy to have too much thrust for once. Quick circularizing burn there. And we're going to set up a return burn. Now you may have noticed that this little probe does not have a heat shield or a parachute or really much capacity to do any kind of landing, and you're probably thinking it would be much smarter to just transmit this science at a reduced rate, because what can we do with returning this? It's just going to burn up in the atmosphere if we try to bring it back. But I do have a plan. I am not completely crazy. It's a bit of a daring plan, and we'll come back to it in just a minute, because after we do this burn, we actually need to switch over to another one of our probes. You can see the Kerbal alarm clock mod in the corner there is telling us that we need to switch over to the crocodile probe because it is approaching Minmus. So that's what we're doing now. Here we have found the crocodile again, and we're finally out at Minmus. It's been quite a while. We just need to set up a burn, and I get my directions confused and pull everything the wrong way. And we do some science experiments. We can't do much. We really did everything that we had of value when we were in orbit of the moon. And we skip ahead time. We actually had to switch back again to the Slider probe while it passed the sphere of influence so I could do a slight adjustment to its periaps. But we're back here. We're circularizing, fighting with the maneuver nodes that got changed when I switched away from it. And now we can do our radar scan of Minmus. So not only are we the first probe to come into the sphere of influence of Minmus, but we're gonna just start off with a nice radar scan, which will hopefully tell us all kinds of useful information about Kerbin's second nearest neighbor. And now this is actually Slider 2. This is the probe we're sending out to Minmus to land and get some surface science. And we need to do a bit of a correction burn now that we're halfway out, because we were not at all in the right inclination when we did our burn to go out to intercept Minmus. So again, I want to do a polar orbit because I've got the fuel and that gives us some more flexibility. We don't have to go to the poles. Let's see how Slider 1 fares during re-entry. Now I've set us up with a 54-kilometer periaps, which is hopefully high enough that we won't re-enter and burn up, but we're going to need to use aero-braking in order to actually lower our orbit. We don't have enough fuel left to get in a low Kerbin orbit without using the atmosphere as a brake. The problem is we're not certain what altitude we need to brake at, because if we go too deep we will overheat and explode, and if we don't go deep enough we'll end up with a still very eccentric orbit that is not useful for us. So here we are. I've switched it down to real time, and the recording software makes the frame rate really bad when you do real time. I don't have to actually play at this frame rate, at least not on this on the desktop. When I was on the laptop, this would happen. Oh boy, we're getting re-entry heating effects already, and we've still got a couple kilometers till our lowest point. And we're seeing all of those gauges pop on. The landing gear, I don't care. Landing gear can burn up. If that engine overheats, that's game over. We've also got 2 science experiments. I'm wondering if I should have transmitted this. But we're almost to periaps, and we see it flip, and now we're going back up again. Plenty of heating effects going on, but it looks like if we can make it through just a few more kilometers of altitude, we will have come out the other side. Of course, then we'll have to worry about whether or not we've lowered our apoaps enough. And I think some of these gauges are still climbing, even though we're on our way back up. Oh, but some of them are starting to blink off. And it looks like we've remained stable throughout because we shifted the fuel down to that bottom tank. So we'll switch back into 4 times time acceleration because we made it. And looking at our orbit, it's still very eccentric, but it is not interacting with the moon, which means we're not going to get kicked off somewhere into oblivion. And after doing some messing around with maneuver nodes, mostly just kind of using them as measuring tools, not really needing to do the burn with them, we determined that we do in fact have enough delta V to make this work. So we got to go out to apoaps and do a little bit of a burn there just to lift the periaps out of the atmosphere. I'm not going to attempt another braking maneuver. It's probably possible, but we're now getting down to an altitude that is going to be reachable. What I want to do is send up a Kerbal. We don't have the advanced grabbing unit to grab this and bring it into a cargo bay or anything fancy like that, but if we can rendezvous with the ship with a Kerbal, we can take the science directly from it and then bring the Kerbal home safely, hopefully, and get the full value from the science data. And hey, that sounds like a great job for a space plane that is trying to justify its existence, since this whole mission is kind of just because we wanted to have a payload for that space plane. So we are burning everything that's left of the fuel, and that's it. Fuel's out, engine shut off. So we're going to have to go get this. There are much more efficient ways to get science from the moon, but this little project seems like it's going to be fun for our spaceplane team. And speaking of science from the moon, this is the Amazon spacecraft launching on the largest rocket I've made in this career so far. We are doing a direct ascent moon mission, so we need a lot of delta V and a lot of thrust early on. And I have not yet unlocked the heavier rocketry node with the mainsail and the other comparable engines on it. So to get this thing into space, we're using those 4 external booster tanks. And each of them has one of those KW double engine bell rockets that gives me the most thrust of any engine that I can get in that size profile. And then after the beautiful separation, we are just on the skipper engine, which barely gives us 1 g of acceleration while we're in the atmosphere. But once we get higher up, we can get some pretty good delta V out of it. This mission is being flown by Grayan Kerman, one of our veteran flyers. We also have Viralyn Kerman, who's going to be our scientist on this mission. This will be her first flight with us. And Jebgel, who's flown with us once before, although I think I kept calling him Albur or whatever. So we're now on our transfer stage, and we have not yet circularized, so that's not ideal. But I did expect to do just a little bit of this circularization burn with our Poodle engine there. But I think our ascent profile wasn't as efficient as it could be. So to circularize this orbit, we are spending a bit of fuel that we'll want to use later. As I said, we're doing a direct descent mission profile, which means that the whole spacecraft is going to land, which also means that the heat shield, the parachutes, everything that we need to come back to Kerbin is also going down to the surface of the moon with us, which means we need to bring the fuel to bring that amount of mass down to the moon. The fuel has to also come with us. So the whole thing ends up being relatively large. But with Kerbal Space Program, it's definitely the simplest way to get to the moon. We're doing our trans-lunar injection burn now on that Poodle engine, and we run out of fuel before we're done, which means we need to switch over explosively to the landing stage. So initially, it doesn't seem very encouraging that we're using our landing engine to just get to the moon in the first place. But I did build in some extra margins for this, so we have our hopes up. We're just going to time warp our way out there, watch the sort of zigzag path as we first go ahead of the moon, and then it starts to catch up on us. Our Kerbals are excited to be the first in the lunar sphere of influence now, and I'm setting up a burn at Periaps to get into a capture orbit around the moon. And at first I was going to just go ahead and land, but now I realize we need to do a little bit of an orbit to kind of pick our landing site before we just go down, or we run the risk of duplicating a science experiment we've already done with one of our unmanned probes. I remembered for once to put lights on this thing, and I also have figured out how to use the Planet Shine brightness slider so that the video software has something to pick up when I'm on the dark side of planets. And now we're lined up for our capture burn. Let's go ahead and use this LV-909, doing physical time acceleration because I get impatient. I can barely hear these little engines. The little vacuum engines seem to be making no noise anymore. But before we pick our landing site, we need to head back to the R&D facility and take a look at what signs we've already got from the moon. So I checked through the surface landed lists that we've done. It was pretty extensive already, just a few probes that actually made it to the surface. We want to find a biome that has not been landed on already by an unmanned probe so that we can get the most science possible. Eventually we'll probably revisit everything in a rover or refueling science lab, something with crazy interstellar technology, but for now, we just passed over that crater area, and just in those few degrees of that orbit, we actually passed over several different biomes. I think it's the East Far Side crater, the Highlands, there's a canyon in there as well. So let's bring up all of our tools here. We don't have a biome map yet. We need to unlock the multispectral scanner from ScanSat. But this will give me some altitude information, and I want to know that so that I can do my periaps as close to the surface as possible without actually hitting something. So that's where we want to land, on the south side of that crater, where it shows that our orbit is going to cross over. And we want to land as close as possible to the boundary between the Highlands and the East Farside crater, because we could potentially get science from both. I don't know that we have the fuel to land it at one and then hop over to another. We may be able to EVA the gap depending on how well we do with our landing. So I've set up with the maneuver node so we are precise about it. Our brave Kerbals are going to attempt an extremely low pass over the surface. Because we have that altitude information from the ScanSat mod, we believe we are going to pass within a kilometer or so of the highest peaks at our landing site, but not too close that we strike into them. We want to get low because that will enable us to have the most efficient possible landing burn. Because we use some of our landing fuel just for the transfer, I'm being really stingy about it. But now I come out of time acceleration and it looks like we're going to hit this ridge, so I don't really even have time to react. But thankfully, the curvature of the moon is a bit deceiving, and we do make it over. And that ridge means that we are now inside the crater that we want to potentially land in. So we extend the landing gear, and I've brought us down to 2 times post time acceleration, so that I can keep up with what's going on. Just looking to pick our landing site, but I'm starting to think that if we don't burn now, we're going to just hit the other crater rim. So Gray and Kerman points us retrograde, and we fire up the main engine. Kerbal engineer will give us some info about our suicide burn distance, but I'm starting to get nervous about the upcoming peaks, and so Grain starts to burn a little bit down as well, trying to reduce our vertical speed. As we kill our orbital speed, we start to fall down to the surface. And as we start to fall, we're going to drop altitude, and those peaks are coming up very quickly. So after doing just a little bit of science, I turn my full attention to try not hit the ground, burning more. We want to just kill our descent. At this point, I've decided to go for a full constant altitude approach, which enables you to kind of look at the terrain as it's coming and try to pick a landing site while you're still also reducing your orbital velocity. But we just want to be not falling at all right now. Those peaks are above us. We need to kill all of this orbit speed. I'm looking at this engine thinking, is this really all I get out of this? I thought I had a thrust to weight ratio on the moon of like 2. So I guess I'm just used to even more power when we do our moon landings. But it's starting to become much more manageable. What isn't manageable is my frame rate, so I go in here to the environmental visual enhancements. Stock visual enhancements has added some moon dust, and for this maneuver I'm just going to turn that off. We wait for that to load, but we turn that off so I can get a little bit more frame rate in the game, and also the counter goes back into the green zone. And hey, we've managed to kill our orbital speed, and now it's just a matter of dropping down onto the surface. We thought to add lights on this one, which is very good because we're in a dark side of the moon. We should have waited just another orbit, and we would probably have had more light. Coming down for a nice slow touchdown, and Grayan, Virulin, and Jebgel become the first Kerbals on the moon. We got to do some science. But that also means that it's time for 4 times time acceleration, because doing science can get very tedious. If you've played the game, you've done a million science experiments. If you haven't played the game, then the science reports, hey, they're spoilers. Opening up our service bay to expose the materials bay, mystery goo, and all the different science materials that we have in there. But pretty soon it becomes obvious that the only thing left to do is to send someone outside. So Virulin is our scientist. She gets the honor of being the first to jump out the hatch and get an EVA report. She doesn't take a surface sample because that feels like cheating. She's like several stories above the ground right now. Climb down the ladder, and then there's a bit of a gap. Mind the gap, Virulin. Just note that there's no ladder in between, but she just drops and catches the other ladder. And from here she can reach some of the science experiments. She can't reach the mystery goo, but she can take these out, and so we can get their full science value. And tries to climb up, notices in the process that we can get flying over the highlands of the moon, or over the east far side crater, I guess we are. And now it's time for a momentous occasion here. Virulin Kerman is about to step onto the surface of the moon. Maybe she'll say something with much gravitas. And she says, "I'm on the moon now, and I'm taking my small steps, and I'm going to take a giant leap for all Kerbal kind." Thank you, Viral, and we appreciate that. And now, please take your surface sample and tell us about the nature of the moon. And I'm noticing she says that the samples here are more dense than normal, but we have not taken a surface sample. So I think that Viral may either she's clairvoyant and she knows what the science will be in the future, or she's getting the low gravity of the moon is going to her head and she's getting confused. Jebjel does a nice twirl. There's small steps, there's giant leaps, and there's big spinny twirls. And finally, it's time for Grayan, who's so excited that after all her piloting and great piloting skills she did getting us safely here, she decides to just go for broke and smash into the ground and roll around. It's a playful time for the Kerbals. Well, thank you for joining me for this episode. We're going to leave our Kerbals here on the moon just for now. Hey, something's orbiting off in the distance. That must be part of one of the space probes that I destroyed in orbit of the moon. But anyway, we're going to leave our Kerbals here for now. We'll pick back up with them in a future episode. Thank you for joining me for episode 7 of SquashWarp, and enjoy the moon.